Well, good afternoon. It is Friday, which is always great news. I hope you're well, and I hope you've got good plans for the weekend. Hopefully you get a chance to rest and relax a little bit and get recharged. As we're starting out today, just one major housekeeping announcement, and that is just the continuing reminder that your paper is due next Friday. So obviously don't let that slip up on you. Be thinking already about how you'll be working on that. Today we'll say a little bit more about that because we're going to talk about Augustine and at least give you the broad contours of his life story and some ideas about how you might want to be looking at his works as you start getting your paper written and formatted and all of that good stuff. Test, you should know your grades by sometime mid next week, and then I'll get those back to you after we return, not next Monday, but the Monday after. You'll be able to actually see those and ask me any questions you may have about your scores, anything that looks murky or confusing on the test, and I'll be glad to illuminate those for you. Any questions you've got as we're starting out today? Any questions you've got? Anything I can answer for you? All right. Well, like I said, for a few moments here at the outset, I would like to say a few words about Augustine of Hippo, one of the greatest theologians in the history of Christianity, and also one of the greatest thinkers in the history of Western and world cultures. One important reason why I want to mention Augustine now is because chronologically we don't get to him before your paper is due. If you note the dates of his lifespan, he lived from 354 to 430 AD. And I put heavy emphasis on that. We need to be remembering that. One of the challenges of this second section, of section 2, is the fact that we are bridging that gap in this section from BC to AD. That is something you'll want to pay attention to as we're moving. Remember, when you're doing the BC centuries, you're counting down, almost like a NASA launch. You know how they count down 10, 9, 8. That's what you're doing in the BC centuries. Of course, once we hit AD, we start moving upwards. We count up 1, 2, 3, 4. So remember that you'll be dealing with both of those in this second section because we'll bridge that gap. Once we get to the reign of Augustus and the birth of Christ, we'll be moving through that AD period. So I emphasize the AD. Augustine lives in the latter part of the Roman period. In fact, he will die at just the moment that the Roman Empire is really beginning to crumble. So we don't chronologically get to him before the paper is due. That's why I like to pause for a moment, even though it's a little bit out of order, and mention some important facts about his life to kind of help you frame your analysis of his work as you're reading these documents we've got posted for you on Canvas. He was born into a family which was divided religiously. His mother, Monica, was a devout Christian. His father, Petronius, was actually a pagan. And I have to explain what that means. In the latter history of the Roman Empire, Christianity comes to dominate, especially the urban areas of the empire. And by the year 380, Christianity is actually made by imperial edict, the official religion of the empire. So by the time Augustine comes to adulthood, Christianity has gone from being a persecuted minority movement within the empire to being the dominant force in the Roman world. An amazing transition. We'll trace the story of that as we go forward. They go from being persecuted by the Roman authorities to eventually being at the center of power and making Christianity the official religion of the empire. So when I use the word pagan, what I'm referring to are adherents to the old Roman religions who are still clinging to the old pantheon of deities that Rome had venerated in her early history and who are holdouts against the advance of Christianity. So in other words, his father is not a Christian. That word pagan comes from the Latin term pagoinai and essentially means country dweller. It's a way that they might refer to someone who lived in the countryside. Almost always, people in rural areas tend to be a little more conservative than folks in the urban centers. And in this case, the reason why there tended to be more holdouts to the old religions than converts to Christianity is because Christian evangelists were essentially targeting the cities because that's where the people were. Evangelists went where there was a bigger population because they wanted to convert as many people as possible to Christianity. So what that meant was the old religions survive in those pockets in the countryside. So this word pagoinai, that basically means country dweller, it eventually comes to mean more specifically someone who's an adherent of the old Roman religions. So when you hear someone use the word pagan or neo-pagan today, that's what that term refers to. People who use the word neo-pagan today see themselves as reviving ancient Greco-Roman forms of religion. You can debate whether they're actually doing that or whether they're doing more innovation than reviving old forms, but that's kind of what they see themselves doing if you hear that terminology. So his father was not a Christian. His mother prayed fervently for him to be converted to Christianity and sought to educate him as much as possible in Christian ideas and theology. Augustine followed his father's example in his early life. When he came to young adulthood, he went to study in the city of Carthage, which by this time is one of the major cities of the Roman Empire. And at Carthage, he lived a very dissolute life as a university student. He essentially experimented with everything you could imagine. And his major struggle is with sexuality. He is very lustful by his own account. He very painstakingly tells us in his writings that he had a hard time resisting those temptations and in fact eventually succumbed to them. And he's known for a very riotous party lifestyle and for a series of revolving relationships that don't really go anywhere, that fall apart. He's characterized by that in those early years. He's also very brilliant at the same time, and he excels at his studies. And one of the things about him is that there's a big gaping hole in his soul. He feels like something needs to be there, but he doesn't know what it is. He's not sure he's convinced it's the faith of his mother. He's also not sure it's the skepticism of his father. And so he's sort of left in this place where he's constantly on this quest for fulfillment. And as part of that, he moves from one philosophical system to another. He is your quintessential experimenter, your quintessential seeker, looking for an idea that will give his life meaning and focus. And so to that end, he moves from one school of thought to another in his early years. He at one time embraces something called Manichaeanism, which is a mystical religion from the Persian Empire. It emphasizes a duality of existence. Essentially, it posits equal forces of good and evil that are at war with each other in the universe. He then moves on from that idea to embrace something that was called Neoplatonism, which is something that should make your ears perk up, because this is a movement that at least saw itself as building a religious system on the ideas of Plato. Now, you could raise a very good conversation, a very valid debate over how much they were actually following in the train of Plato and how much they were providing their own innovations that may have tweaked things to such a degree that you're getting more of them than you are actually of Plato. But in this Neoplatonic system, he is introduced to some of Plato's foundational ideas. Foremost among them, the idea that there is a greater reality out there in the invisible world, of which this reality here on this earth is a reflection, and a pale reflection at that. And so Augustine is influenced to some degree by those notions that we saw Plato introducing in his Allegory of the Cave when we read that particular work. Well, he goes through this period of training at Carthage. At one point, one of his affairs results in the birth of a son. His son's name is Adeodatus. And interestingly enough, that name Adeodatus, it means gift of God. So even at this moment when he's kicking against the goad, so to speak, he's kicking against that attempt by his mother to persuade him to embrace Christianity, he's still sort of acknowledging the idea that his son is a gift from God. Somehow, we don't know exactly how, the son ends up being in Augustine's care, not that of his mother. She is not much of a presence in his life. She comes in and out, but she's not a major figure in either of their lives. And so he ends up taking care of the raising of this son. And eventually, when he moves to Italy, he'll take his son with him and he'll start studying at some of the greatest rhetorical schools in Italy. And he's going to continue this quest for meaning. He comes into contact with one of the most famous Christian leaders of the 4th century AD, a man by the name of Ambrose of Milan. Ambrose is renowned throughout Christian history as being one of the greatest preachers in Christian history. You can still read some of his sermons And it's not quite the same reading a sermon as it is hearing a sermon. Sermons are meant to be heard, not read necessarily. So if you've got a sermon that reads well on the page, then the pastor's doing a very good job, because it is hard to transfer that energy and that style that you get from behind the pulpit into writing onto the page. Ambrose, you can sense that energy and that fire even as you're reading copies of his sermons, which are still available today in various collections. We've got a collection of the early church fathers in Dort's library. You can actually read some of these sermons by people who are preaching in the 200s, 300s AD. So that's pretty cool to be able to access, to have contact with something that ancient, that is intimately connected with something that is the most precious thing you hold still today. There's something powerful about that, to realize this faith that we hold is a very ancient faith, stretching so far back to the very beginnings. So Augustine is enthralled and fascinated by the preaching of Ambrose. One thing about Ambrose is he is an educated man, and he's someone who is very skillful at turning a phrase. A lot of the Latin translations of the Bible at this point, and a lot of the ministry that was going on in Latin, was not the greatest. The Latin translations of the Bible were not very good. It's going to be during Augustine's lifetime that Jerome translates the Latin Vulgate. And once he does this, you've got a better translation of the Bible, one that's more readable for people who are educated. So Augustine's perspective on the Bible was a little bit shaded by the fact that all he had seen were poor examples of Bible translation. That's one reason why Ambrose really captivated him, because here was a Christian who was also a very deep thinker, and here were translations of the Bible that were actually stylish and appealed to his sense of rhetorical style. He is actually a teacher of rhetoric. He's essentially a teacher of speech. He was working at Dort today. Before his conversion, he would be in the communications department, teaching people how to more effectively communicate rhetoric. Then I guess after his conversion, we moved him down to the theology department. But what he did first was teach people speech, essentially, and how to have well-crafted style. So through Ambrose, he began to be influenced in regard to Christian theology and some of the very pivotal ideas that are going to turn his life later on. He also experiences the death of some very close friends about this time. And this gets him thinking about the nature of mortality and what happens to us after we die. There's a great moment, which actually you're going to be reading about because it's part of one of your excerpts, which he talks about in his book, The Confessions, where he is sitting in a garden and he has a copy of the Bible, and he thinks he hears the voice of a child over the garden wall saying, "Telelaga, telelaga" in Latin, which means take up and read, take up and read. And he essentially picks up his copy of the scriptures and he reads this passage from the book of Romans, where Paul is saying for people to throw off the works of darkness and to embrace the light of Christ. And this, of course, speaks very directly to Augustine, because that's essentially what he was living in, a world of darkness, a world of lustful deeds. And he's being called upon in this passage to throw those things off and embrace Christ. He ends up doing that and ultimately becomes a very sincere convert to Christianity. He is baptized, as is his son. His mother, Monica, joins them in Italy, and he goes through this period of spiritual instruction and growth. And then eventually he returns to North Africa and becomes pastor of the church in a little town called Hippo Regius. It's right down the road from Carthage. So he's ministering in a small town that's not very far from one of the biggest ports in the Roman world. He had essentially gone down there to start a monastery. This is the time when monks and nuns are beginning to appear. And that's what he wanted, was a life of quiet solitude, prayer, and contemplation. But when the people of Hippo heard he was there, their bishop essentially called him out as his successor and said, "This is the man that God has appointed to be my successor." And Augustine accepts that as the will of God, and he ends up becoming the bishop at Hippo. He's going to serve in that capacity from the mid 390s, about 395, until the end of his life in 430. He is a prolific writer. You have selections from two of his works. One of them is the Confessions. The Confessions was actually written as his spiritual autobiography to tell the story of his conversion. It was intended to answer some critics who were questioning whether he was qualified to serve as Bishop of Hippo. Augustine's response is to write the full story of his conversion and also to give you 3 extra chapters on the first few chapters of Genesis. He's got commentary at the end on the early text, the creation text of the book of Genesis. So that's how you read this as you're approaching that text. It's in a very narrative format. It's kind of written in the style of a prayer, the whole thing is. And it's very famous for the first line, where he essentially says, our hearts are restless, O Lord, and they are restless until they find rest in thee. Essentially, that was the story of his entire life, this emptiness, this all-consuming emptiness that he needed to fill, and his realization that the only way it could be filled was by coming to Christ, God filling that place. You hear people sometimes talk about a God-shaped vacuum in people's lives. Everyone needs God to fill that spot, that emptiness. That's what Augustine is essentially saying. Our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. And so that is the account in the Confessions of the course of his life up to the time he became Bishop of Hippo and the reasons why he feels compelled to serve God in that capacity. The other selection is a later work that he started writing about 413. It is The City of God. And we've already talked a little bit about the occasion for it. In the year 410, a group of Germanic tribesmen called the Goths, not dressed in black as far as I know, nor do they wear white makeup, but they were called the Goths. They invaded Rome. They sacked Rome. And even though the Romans were able to survive that, the Roman Empire continues for a little while, it is one of the early signs that the Roman Empire is falling apart. And a lot of people don't know what to do with that. By this point in time, Rome had a reputation as the eternal city. The Roman Empire had stood for 1,000 years. We in the United States of America, we cannot imagine a time when America had not been here because it's such an integral part of the world. And yet our country is still relatively young. We've only been here roughly about 250 years. In fact, we're about to start celebrating the 250th anniversaries of a lot of the hallmark events of the American Revolution. There's going to be one thing after the other over the next decade. We just celebrated I don't know if you celebrate it, but the 250th anniversary of the Boston Massacre. And from this point forward, Boston Tea Party, Declaration of Independence. Over the next 2 decades, we'll be celebrating the 250th anniversaries of those events. We're still relatively young compared to some of these other empires and nations. So we couldn't imagine a world without the United States. So then try to put yourselves in the shoes of these Romans who had had this entity in existence for 1,000 years, and imagine them trying to grasp that it might be crumbling. It's just unthinkable. For them, it seemed like the very apocalypse. I mean, for them, they couldn't imagine how the world continued without the Roman Empire. And many of them were throwing shade at Christianity, saying that the empire was fine until these Christians started ascending to power. And then look at the empire. And the City of God is basically Augustine's response to that, saying you can't lay this at the door of Christianity. The Roman Empire has been crumbling. It has had systemic problems for centuries. And he lays those out. He goes so far as to even go back to Aeneas, as we said the other day. But he also is doing something even more important in this text than defending Christianity. He's also laying out a systematic Christian philosophy of history. In fact, some people refer to the Confessions as the first Christian spiritual autobiography, and they refer to the City of God as the first Christian systematic philosophy of history. He's attempting to interpret all of human history from a Christian perspective in the City of God. It's an interesting read. It's also a very long read. It is a massive book. I mean, we're talking like War and Peace size. I read through it once with the class that was an upper level seminar class, and all we did was read great text that semester. And one time I read through the entire thing with the class, and it was a fun experience. It was a fruitful experience. They were all history and lit majors, so it was their thing. It is fruitful and fun. Most people just read excerpts from it though, because it is a massive undertaking to read the whole thing. It's a fascinating work, and the pieces that you've got from it should be very interesting, especially when you look at them in light of your readings of Plato as well. Alongside those works, which you'll be reading, Augustine is known for towering contributions to Western and world Christian theology. Some people say, in fact, several historians have been quoted as saying the Reformation of the 16th century was in some ways a battle between two different sides of Augustine, with Roman Catholics emphasizing his theology of the church and Protestants emphasizing his theology of sin and salvation. And there's something to that because both traditions, Catholic and Protestant, still honor Augustine's achievements and they accept much of what he did as foundational for them. For Catholics, his ideas about church structure, his ideas about the nature of repentance and confession, a lot of that's incorporated into Catholic theology. For Protestants, and I would underscore especially for Reformed Protestants, Augustine has a number of important things that he bequeaths to us. First and foremost, he is the one that begins the movement of looking at Paul's letters and seeing in Paul's letters these notions that we refer to today as original sin and election or predestination. Augustine is one of the first thinkers to really highlight this based on his interpretation of the letters of Paul. He talks about this idea that humanity doesn't just sin sometimes, humanity has a sin nature by virtue of our link to Adam and Eve. And therefore, we have a compulsion to sin. And our will is disabled by that compulsion. And so, therefore, the only way to reanimate the human will and to save the human soul is for one to come to God through Christ. And once one comes to God through Christ, Christ reanimates the soul and reanimates the will so that one can choose. One will not always choose because human beings are always imperfect, but one has the possibility of choosing to follow the righteous path because of the grace of God through Christ and the presence of the Holy Spirit in someone's life. Now, what I'm saying right now is probably something most of you have heard your entire lives and you take for granted that we've always stated things in that way. But before the time of Augustine, that formal statement of how that theology fits together in the letters of Paul and other parts of the New Testament hadn't really been put forth in that explicit sort of summary. So this is a massive contribution he makes, one that, of course, is still affecting us down to the present day. There are other areas as well where he addressed issues of what you do when someone had been a martyr and other people had chosen not to be martyred, but later they had repented of that. Should they be received back into the church? He was a part of debates over that, debates over the nature of the church calendar and how you observe different times of the year. So many things we could go into. I've got a collection of the early writings of the church fathers in my office, and there are a couple of series of that focus on people before Augustine. And then I literally, no exaggeration, have got 12 volumes on my shelf, all of which have got materials from Augustine, from sermons to writings on teaching to his Confessions and City of God. He was extremely prolific as a writer, produced a multitude of works that still survive today. So that's a little bit of who he is, who he was, and who he continues to be for all of us. Any questions you've got about the text, something that may have confused you that maybe I can help illuminate a little bit, or about Augustine himself as you're looking at critiquing and analyzing his works over the next week or so? Any questions? Any questions? It's often been said that Augustine was the last great ancient man and the first great medieval man. And what they mean by that is he is a very transitional figure. He is one that's kind of leading people through the latter stages of the ancient world, and he's previewing what's going to be coming in the medieval world. So we will be talking about him more as we get closer to that time period. As I said last time, if you have any questions about the paper, if you need some direction, wondering if things are shaping up well in your analysis, I'm glad to offer that to you. Just let me know. And of course, the AEC always stands ready to help as well. Yes, sir.
Like, obviously, an essay should be as long as it takes to like convey the concept that you're trying to convey well. But in your like experience, like how long about as like a successful essay then on this?
Well, the parameters for the paper are 4 to 5 pages.
Okay.
So that's your page limit. And let me do say, somebody asked me about this the other day, and it was a good question. What is 4 pages? 4 pages is at least most of the page of page 4, like almost to the very bottom, if not spilling over into page 5. That's 4 pages. I have gotten some that are like 3 pages in a paragraph. That is not 4 pages. That's 3 pages in a paragraph. So it should be 4 pages with at least most of page 4 done, and probably smart to spill over into page 5. So that's the page limit. Now, in terms of how it breaks down, and saying what works best, I can kind of give you the template for what works well, but then there are all kinds of ways you can be creative with that as well and still get the job done, and sometimes get it done better. But usually what people do is they go into it, they talk about one thinker for maybe a page or a page and a half or so. Then they talk about the other thinker, what they observed in that thinker's work for a page and a half or so. And then they bring it together. They talk about the comparisons and contrasts. Now, not everybody does it like that. Some people go ahead and start from the beginning and they say, okay, I'm going to frame it where I talk about the comparisons. Here are the things they've got in common. And then here are the contrasts. The difficulty of that formulation is you're comparing them already in those first few paragraphs. And that can get a little bit confusing which one you're talking about if you have it laid out. Okay, this is what this one thinks. This is what that one thinks. This is what I think about what they think in comparison to each other. But that structure can work if you just do it well and make it clear from the start. If you're comparing from the very beginning who you're talking about, this is Plato, this is Augustine. And when you get to the question of Plato versus Socrates, or not so much Plato versus Socrates, but who's talking here, Plato or Socrates, it's an understanding, it's understood when you go into this that anytime Socrates is speaking, he's speaking as defined by Plato. He's speaking as mediated to us through Plato. So don't worry too much about mixing that up. We all know what you're talking about when you say in Plato, even if it's through the mouth of Socrates. Plato's the one that wrote it. If you say Socrates said it, that's fine as well, because Plato is quoting Socrates supposedly.
So yeah, about that. So like pretty much all of Plato's writings are like about Socrates, except for like what the document tells us about Plato himself. So are we just to assume that what Plato said about Socrates, Plato himself believes those things?
Yes, I mean, definitely that Plato believes that's what Socrates would have said, or at least that he wants us to believe that's what Socrates would have said. He's promoting his teacher, wanting all of us to embrace his teachings. So yeah, at the very least, this is what Plato wants us to believe Socrates said.
So like, are we comparing and contrasting Socrates with Augustine or Plato with Augustine? Because how can we know what Plato would have believed if he's writing about what Socrates believed?
Well, because we assume that what he repeats from Socrates, he is affirming.
Okay.
And the real doubt is not so much did Plato buy the things he's saying that Socrates said, because he seems to endorse them. The big question is, did Socrates say them or not? Are we getting Plato's version of Socrates? And that's what we can never know, because we don't have any writings from Socrates. There's nothing to test against Plato's version of Socrates. Today, like say if there's a question on, what did Abraham Lincoln do in a particular situation? Well, we can actually go back and compare not just what one person said about Lincoln, but we've got a multitude of sources, including some things written by Lincoln himself regarding his attitudes towards certain things that we can compare. We could say, okay, well, William Seward's version of who Lincoln is, yeah, it's right this way, but then it's not true to Lincoln in that way, because we have words from the man himself that says something different. Well, we don't have that in regard to Socrates. So yeah, it's something where you have to keep that critical component in mind. We are limited because our sources are limited. That problem we talked about in the very beginning, which it's a bigger problem in ancient history, but it's not exclusive to ancient history. In every generation, there are issues we try to explore, and we do have to be careful not to go beyond our sources. We are limited by the sources we have. And sometimes that's frustrating if you're somebody who wants to get to the facts. If you're like a historical fiction writer or filmmaker, it's great because they love those ambiguities. That's where they play. They can fill in those gaps with whatever they want to and make it a more compelling story sometimes.
And are we supposed to just use those sources on Canvas?
You are not strictly limited to them. They definitely need to be the core of what you do. But if you want to use, like, say, other secondary sources to look at the life of Plato or Augustine to give you more background information, that's fine. If you want to reference one of their other writings, and there are plenty of others you can reference, that's okay as well. I would ask that if you do that, you cite it for me so that I know where it's coming from, and that often does enrich people's analysis. Having said that, though, for this one, for this assignment, you're only required to use those texts I gave you. Remember, this one is more about honing your ability to interpret and read sources well. The next one, the film paper, is going to step it up a little bit. It takes it to the next level. And there, you are going to want to use a variety of sources, and you're going to be demonstrating how you can take those primary sources and use them to critique something else. Use them to tell the story of a historical event, and use more than one or two of them. Good questions. Any other questions? This is the convenient time to ask. Any questions? Time when everyone can hear. All right. Well, hopefully that gives you at least a better sense of how to approach Augustine, especially where you've got some, questions about how the stuff you see on the page relates to his actual life and influence. Let me know if other questions occur. Also, as we continue to move forward in the history of Rome, we will most likely begin to see some other parallels as well that will help you, because essentially what we're doing is creating the world that Augustine was living in and writing in, and that will help give you some context as well. In some ways, it's also the world that he's losing at that moment, and that's worth thinking about for a little bit. History is full of beginnings and endings, and there are few times more tragic in history as when a society begins to implode. And as you're studying that history, you grieve with the people who are going through it. And with Augustine, you very much see that. His love for the culture and the world that he's born into and raised with, and then that growing awareness that that world is crumbling. He was a person with tremendous hope for the kingdom of God, and he saw in the end that the kingdom of God was always superior to the kingdoms of this world. That's the point that he's making in the City of God. So I'm sure that he had comfort in his death that God's kingdom would prevail and good things would emerge eventually. But it is tragic that as he's dying, his own city is being sacked by a group called the Vandals, who gave their name to the practice of vandalism for a reason. They're a rough crowd who tears things up left and right. And so as he is dying, as he is leaving this world, he's hearing the sounds of his world falling apart. That's tough. So the world that we're building right now is the world that's going to be dying as Augustine himself is dying. And with that cheery acknowledgement, let's look back at the origins of that world for a few moments. We've kind of split our time between the paper and the Romans today. The Romans probably resent that because they always like being the center of attention. From this point forward, the Romans are going to occupy our full focus for just a little bit before we start talking about the rise of Christianity. We had left things in a very interesting place last time. The Roman people were subject to a group known as the Etruscans, a more powerful civilization that lived to the north of where Rome was situated on the Italian peninsula. In the year 509, the reigning Etruscan king was a guy named Tarquin, who was known to history as Tarquin the Proud, for obvious reasons. He was a guy that was very well convinced he was the God's gift to humanity, I guess you might say, during this period. Tarquin had a son by the name of Sextus. He was a spoiled, unruly prince. And Sextus became enamored with a Roman woman by the name of Lucretia. He desired her and decided he had to have her, but there was a problem. One, she was not interested in him at all. And two, she was a married woman, which is also connected to her absolute lack of interest in his offer. Sextus forces himself on her and commits a horrific act of sexual assault. Lucretia, so overwhelmed with the sorrow and the violation of what has been done to her, commits suicide. Her husband and her family are, of course, enraged. And this seems to be coupled with an already growing resentment among the Roman people of the heavy-handed rule of the Etruscans. So it's not just this event, it never is just one event. But this horrific tragedy essentially lights the fuse that has been burning for a while. It has been gathering for a while. There's a Roman leader by the name of Brutus. And Brutus is convinced by Lucretius' family to take up arms against the Etruscans. They decide that now is the time to move against them. This is a very important thing, the name of this leader, because later on, Marcus Brutus, another Roman, aspires to be a revolutionary in the same vein. This man, of course, will be the one who leads the rebellion against Julius Caesar. We'll talk about that famous event soon, the Ides of March and all of that. This original Brutus is successful in his quest. He and the united Roman peoples overthrow the Etruscans and capture the city of Rome to be ruled once again by Romans. In the year 509, they establish a system of government that they call in Latin a res publica. Res publica. Res publica can be translated into English as public thing. Essentially, the public forum, the public structure is the idea. In English, we combine those two words, res publica, and we call their form of government a republic. This is a form of government that has arisen in various places throughout the centuries, of course, very notably in this country as well. The United States of America is essentially a republican system of government, a democratic republic that has representative bodies that express the will of the people. And so in many ways, the system of government you're most familiar with is one that is based upon these models as well, this model of a res publica, a public entity that is built on representation, which expresses the will of the people. There are some facets to this government that are worth mentioning before we go forward, because they're going to play an important role in the stories that we are about to tell. First of all, the government meets in the center of Rome at a place known as the Forum. This is the heart of the Roman Republic, and one day will be the heart of the Roman Empire as well. It still exists today. You go to the city of Rome, you can walk around the modern city and then go to the old quarter, and you literally step off a contemporary street with all of the trappings of contemporary culture and right into the ancient world, where many of the old buildings of the old Roman Forum still stand. Very old, some of them crumbling, but they are still there to be explored by contemporary visitors. In Roman society, there are three rough divisions. First of all, there are the group known as the patricians. The patricians are the upper crust of Roman society. They are the elite. They are what the Greeks would have called the aristocrats. The patricians are the leaders and the upper crust of Roman society. They are the wealthier members of the society. Beneath the patricians and lowest in rank are the plebeians. The plebeians are the ordinary people, ranging from the very poor to those just of middling rank without any major titles. The plebeians. These are the lower classes. That word plebeians has been used since then to refer to people of inferior status in any kind of organization. I often describe it kind of tongue in cheek as being a high school freshman for your entire life. You are always in the lower rung. Thankfully, college freshmen are not persecuted nearly as much as high school freshmen sometimes are. So being a plebeian is kind of like being a high school freshman for the rest of your life. And actually at West Point Military Academy still, the entering students are known as, quote, plebs, and they are hazed usually in the first few days they are there as a rite of initiation. So even today in our military academy, they're known as plebs, those beginning students. Now, there is a rank in between plebeians and patricians. And this is an important thing to note, not just for Roman society, but for other societies we're going to be talking about as well. These people are called equestrians. And in many ways, they are much like the plebeians. They're not necessarily vastly more wealthy than the plebeians, but they do have enough wealth to enable them to acquire one thing that sets them apart from the plebeians. Based on their name, what is that one thing that they are able to acquire that elevates them? Yes. And why would this elevate them amongst the common crowd? That's absolutely true. And let's extend that a little bit. That is true. It's like a car. You own something where you can get around and you can have some mobility that other people don't have. There's one specific place where that's very valuable to the society. What role would that be? Yes, military conflict. Someone who is an equestrian is able to acquire a benefit that other people can't acquire. That's the ability to have a horse. They got the mobility there. Even more importantly, someone who's got a horse can bring that horse to battle as well. I don't want to draw this parallel too closely because we have to remember there are important differences between various societies, but you can almost say loosely that the equestrians are the knights of the Roman world. Later on, when we get to the medieval period, a knight is essentially a person that's got enough money to offer his feudal lord military service because they can outfit themselves with armor and they own a horse. Oftentimes, that ability to render military service will elevate people. It will enable them to achieve greater autonomy and greater rights. Just some examples. During the Persian War, when you had these rowing crews on the triremes, once that war was over, the people who rode the triremes agitated for greater rights in the body politic, and they eventually received them because of their service in warfare. Women agitated for the vote for years in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and then World War I happens, and women step up and they serve in roles while men are away at war. And once those men come back, they take those jobs back. The women stand up and they say, okay, we've been crying out for the right to vote for almost 50 years now. We were here at this moment of crisis. We stepped up. And now we want to say in how our societies are governed and organized. And it's at that point, after World War I, women start gaining traction. One of the big things that fueled the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s is the fact that African-American soldiers served in World War II. And then they say very loudly and very clearly in the 1950s, we have been trying to get equal rights for 100 years now. It's been denied to us. We have served our country. We have bled for our country. We now call out for the recognition of equal rights and the right to vote without being coerced. And you begin to see traction. So oftentimes military service will help to advance the cause of people gaining greater rights and autonomy. That's what happens here with the equestrians, because they are valuable for serving the interest of defense. They end up getting greater privileges in Roman society than the run-of-the-mill plebeian. So this is an interesting thing that actually is a feature that goes far beyond Roman history. We see it reflected often in other realms of human history as well. Now, in terms of the governmental structure, I'm not going to overburden you with details about the Roman government, but there are a few basic things that are worth knowing about how it operates. First of all, there's not a single executive officer in the beginning. Instead, there are two. This is similar to what we saw with the Greeks. There are two executive officers known as consuls, and the consuls only serve for 1 year at a time. This is to prevent any one faction or interest group getting a hold on the consulship. So you have consuls that are elected who serve 1 year at a time, and then sometimes they can rotate back in later if they desire to and serve another term. But eventually what happens, once you've served as a consul, you move up to the body known as the Senate, which is the chief legislative body of the Roman world, the Senate. That word Senate comes from the Latin term senex, not like the gas station. This is senex with an S. Although if the gas station helps you remember it, then it's worth remembering. But senex actually means elders, wise men, wise women. In this case, mostly wise men, but eventually wise women as well. Senex means elders, the wise ones. Anyone who served in the lower offices eventually became part of the Roman Senate, and they would be the chief deliberative body of first the Roman Republic, and then eventually the period of the Roman Empire as well. The Senate never quite goes away. It does change depending on who's in power. Early on, you'd have about roughly 300 senators or so, and then there actually came a period where you had a radically oversized Senate. At one point, it extended to the size of about 600 people. During the reign of Julius Caesar, he stacked the Senate to as many as 900 people. Why do you think he would do that? Because, famously, as we're going to see, if you don't know already, the Senate was not a huge fan of Julius Caesar. Why would he have grown it to 900 people? Absolutely. It's a little bit of Senate packing going on here. He is both diluting the power of individual senators, and he's also stacking it with people that are in his pocket, people that are in agreement with his policies. So he will bring about its largest growth. There'll be 600 senators, and then 900 during his reign. And then once Augustus comes to power and the empire comes into play, they want to start shrinking that again, because if you're an emperor, you don't want an oversized Senate. An oversized Senate could be a headache. You're wanting to shrink that body so you have more ability to control through executive power the functions of the empire. And so eventually it'll shrink back down to 300. Now there's one more office I want to mention before we finish up today. This one is a very unusual office that has a very clear rationale behind it, but it is also the Achilles heel of the Roman Republic. And this is the office of dictator. Democracy is a brilliant system, but like every system, it's got its strengths and it's got its weaknesses as well. Winston Churchill at one point said, democracy is the worst system of government except for every other system that's ever been tried. He said, democracy is the worst system of government except for every other system that's ever been tried. That was typical Winston Churchill. He was very tongue-in-cheek. And he said that at a point where he's very frustrated because the House of Commons was holding up some legislation that he was wanting to get passed. He was getting frustrated with the slowness of democratic process. And we've seen that. We see it all the time. At one time, very famously, when the houses of Congress were having a hard time getting along in the U.S., they would use the term gridlock, which is what occurs when the houses are, having a problem getting legislation through. That happens, when you're debating things, when you're deliberating, it takes time sometimes to get things done. And when you have a crisis, sometimes the fear is that things won't move quickly enough. And so the Roman answer to that problem was to create a very interesting and somewhat unique office. This is the office of the dictator. The idea behind it is that if Rome is thrown into crisis, if, for instance, there's an invasion of Roman territory, the Senate has the power to secede the entire authority of government to one person. They choose one person who essentially becomes an absolute dictator. Our notion of what dictator is comes from this office. They have absolute power, absolute control for a period of 6 months. And they are tasked to meet the crisis. They have at their disposal the entire series of resources that can be offered by the Roman Republic. Their job is to deal with the crisis. If the crisis is not abated at the end of 6 months, their term can be renewed by the Senate. So this office presents an interesting safeguard against crisis. But when we get back, we'll also talk about some of the dangers this office poses. And of course, we'll see them realized as we continue looking at the history of the empire. Have a great weekend. Let me know if I can assist you in any way. And I look forward to seeing you on Monday, if not before.